Hello YouTube! Welcome back to another day of playing Minecraft Hardcore until I eventually die, and I figured it connected really well with a book I recently read, Les Misérables, and while playing I didn't really expect them to connect at all, but they kind of do in a subtle way. At the center of it is Jean Valjean, who is imprisoned for stealing bread to feed his sister's starving child. And I think that detail kind of sets the tone for the whole book, because it's not really interested in crime in a simple sense, but more interested in survival and what happens when society treats survival like something that deserves punishment. Valjean spends years in prison, and when he gets out, it's like he's still trapped in a different way. He can't find work, he's constantly rejected, and no matter where he goes, people only see his past. So even though he's technically free, socially, he's not. Then he meets the bishop, and that moment basically shifts everything. Valjean steals from him, and instead of sending him back to the prison, the bishop lies to protect him and gives him the silver. And it's not framed like a dramatic miracle moment, but more quiet. It's completely changing the direction of Valjean's life. It introduces this idea of someone choosing mercy, and that can actually interrupt a cycle that otherwise keeps repeating. After that, Valjean tries to rebuild himself under a new identity. He becomes successful, eventually ending up in a position of respect, and takes in Cosette, a child that has basically been left in an exploitive situation with the Thénardiers. Cosette's story connects back to Fantine. Her mother, and Fantine's arc is one of the clearest examples of how the book looks at poverty. She's not making free choices in the way people like to think of them. Everything she does is shaped by desperation and lack of options, and the book is pretty blunt about how society judges her while ignoring these conditions that pushed her there in the first place. Socially, the book keeps coming back to this idea that people aren't just individuals making isolated choices. Class, poverty, and access to support systems basically shape what choices even exist. And a lot of the tragedy comes from people being treated like their situation is purely personal, when it's actually structural. Then there's Javert, who represents a completely different way of thinking. For him, law is absolute. Identity doesn't really change, and if someone breaks the law, that defines them permanently. And the story kind of builds this quiet conflict between Valjean and Javert around that question. Is a person what they did, or can they become something else over time? Valjean is basically living proof of change. Javert can't really process this idea without breaking his entire worldview. Later in the book, the focus shifts into the student revolution in Paris, which is where the political side becomes a lot more direct. This is set during a period in France where everything was kind of unstable politically, monarchy, empire, republic, shifting back and forth over time. So the revolution in the book isn't happening in a vacuum. It's part of a larger pattern of people repeatedly trying to reshape the system. The students who build the barricade are really idealistic. They believe change is possible and that if people are willing to act, the system can be pushed into something better. The barricade itself becomes more than a physical structure. It's kind of symbolic of drawing a line between how things are and how they could be. But what's interesting is that the book doesn't treat it like a clean, heroic moment. It shows how fragile it is. They're committed, but they're also small compared to what they're up against, and there's this constant sense that belief alone isn't enough to control what actually happens. So politically, it's not really simplifying anything. It's not saying revolution is good or bad. It's more like showing how messy it is when people try to change systems that are already deeply established. There's hope, but there's also a lot of uncertainty and cost attached to it. And I think culturally, it also reflects the fact that France at the time was dealing with repeated cycles of political change. Hugo isn't just writing about one event. He's kind of writing about what it feels like to live in a society where stability is never fully stable. Meanwhile, in the background of all this, I've just been playing Minecraft Hardcore. Right now, I'm mining, not even in a cave, just doing the usual loop, placing torches, breaking blocks, moving forward. It's pretty repetitive in the moment, but it also has that thing where you kind of stop paying attention to how far you've gone until something changes. Earlier, I ended up in a deep cave section without really planning to. It didn't feel dangerous right away, just less controlled than the tunnel I was in before. And that's usually where things start to get risky. In hardcore, when you're just thinking, I'll go a little further and then turn back, and then you don't. I kept mining a bit longer than I should have, and it was basically it. And that's where this episode ends. I think part of what makes Les Mis stick with me is how often it pauses, even in the middle of all the story and politics and everything happening, to say something really direct about life itself. It doesn't always do it loudly, but when it does, it kind of reframes everything. There's a line that says, "It is nothing to die. It is frightful not to live." And I don't think it's really about death in a dramatic way. It feels more like it's talking about what it means to exist in a life that isn't fully lived, or is limited by circumstance, which ties back to the characters like Valjean at the beginning, or Fantine, where survival itself takes over everything else. And then it also says, "To love or have loved, that is enough. Ask nothing further. There's no other pearl to be found in the dark folds of life," which feels almost like the book stepping back and saying that even when everything else is unstable, law, society, politics, identity, there are still these very human connections that end up mattering more than anything else. And there's another moment that really connects to the revolution side of the story, where it describes the ideal as something almost fragile but still persistent. The ideal is terrifying to behold, brilliant but threatened on all sides by the dark forces that surround it, nevertheless no more in danger than a star in the jaws of the clouds. And I think that's kind of what the book keeps circling back to, that the tension between people trying to reach towards something better, socially, politically, personally, and the reality that everything around them is always pushing back against them in some way. Not to say that it cancels out, but that it makes it complicated and not guaranteed. Part of why I love this book is that it doesn't really try to be easy. It's long and it feels overwhelming at times, but it feels like that's kind of the point. It's one of those books where even if you don't catch everything the first time, it still gives you something to think about. And I think there's something valuable in that it doesn't reduce the big ideas into something simple or fast, but it just lets them exist as they are. So I think that's why I've been enjoying it. It's not neat, but it feels intentional in that messiness. And I guess it brings me back here. Trying to mine, being careful not to do anything stupid. Oh my gosh, I just fell into a hole. Oh, and there's a baby zombie. No. Nope. Please, oh my gosh. Well, that's over. Thanks for coming. I guess that's the end of the series of playing hardcore mode until I die. Peace and blessings.